What's up, everybody? This is Sandy Golston back here with another video. This one's going to be a little bit of a different type of a video that I'm going to be bringing to you today, because in this video, I'm going to talk about how I outline the stories that I typically write, the novels, the novellas that I typically write. And so what I've done is I have just given you kind of on the screen share here, you can hopefully see just a basic flavor for how I typically do the outlines. Now, I have to admit that even though, let me start here. It's National Novel Writing Month coming up in November, NaNoWriMo. So for NaNoWriMo, what I decided to do was a little more of a hardcore type of outline than I usually would do for a book that I'm going to write. And so a part of that is because I don't want to get stuck at a certain point. And typically for me, where I get stuck is probably about 10 to 15,000, maybe up to 20,000 words is where I typically get stuck if I haven't done my due diligence in terms of an outline. So I want to make sure that that does not happen this particular time, because the goal, of course, is 50,000 words in the month of November. And as you know, November is, it's kind of for people in northern states like me in Michigan. You got the seasons are starting to change. You've got, of course, for everybody, you've got Thanksgiving coming up at the end of the month. So for some people who, want to spend time with their family over Thanksgiving, then, that's probably going to be a big time commitment that you're going to have to deal with. Not to say that deal with in a negative way, but you're going to have to spend that time because you typically want to, even in these COVID times. So it's going to be a challenge, but I've done 50,000 words in a month before. I've done it multiple times. So never for NaNoWriMo. This is my first year doing NaNoWriMo, but I do have experience getting that many words in 1 month. And one of the things that I'm hoping will help me, because I want to experiment with the slightly more detailed outline. So that's what the crux of this video is today. And what I'm going to do is just kind of walk you through it here in the most basic way in terms of what the outline is. So where I typically start is, and I don't know if everybody else does it this way, but where I typically start is with basically what you would see on the back cover of a paperback, or what you would typically see on the inside cover of a hardcover book. So your synopsis, your book description. And I don't know why I've always done that, but I've always done it that way. I've always written the book description first, the synopsis first. And that is the first thing I knock out, because that's kind of the way that I visualize it in my head. Excuse me right there. But that's how I visualize it in my head. And so I typically go from there after getting that synopsis done. It just helps me to visualize it a little bit better before I really jump in to start actually writing the story. So I go through it and I write it just the way I imagined it. Now, this would not necessarily be the finished back cover or inside flap cover that I would use on a published book, but it's pretty close and pretty faithful to what that would look like. So that is my starting point there. So from there, most of my stories are character driven. So I typically think of the character, at least the main character first. And then after I think about the main character and what that main character is like and what that main character is going to go through, that's when I come up with the rest of the story. So again, character driven stories. And so one of the most fun early parts for me is coming up with the character descriptions and the characters' characteristics, if you will, to really start to sharpen the focus and to make sure that the character and the character descriptions fit what the synopsis is, what the basic summary of the book is going to be. So that is the challenge, to marry those two together and to make sure that I'm consistent with where I started and then moving on to that second step. So that's where I get going there. And so usually my stories, typically it's just one or two key characters that drive my stories. I know sometimes you'll see stories that'll have like, 5, 10 characters or more that all play a fairly important role in the story. And that's not typically the way I get down in terms of the stories that I write. I usually keep it pretty intimate with a couple of key characters that really set the tone and really drive it. I want to keep you focused on those two key characters as much as possible. And so that's kind of my approach to that. So it usually starts with, in my mind, and I don't necessarily exposition it right out, of course, in a book, but in my mind, I picture what the character is going to look like. And I'll write down, so the physical characteristics of the character, so their race, their height, their hair color, their eye color, how tall they are, what their physical build is. And I do this mainly because I want to remain consistent. I don't want to have a character with, brown eyes in the first couple of chapters, and then by chapter 14 they have blue eyes or green eyes or something like that. So I want to make sure that I'm staying consistent. I don't want them to be 5'9" in chapter 1, and then by chapter 20 they're somehow 5'11". It doesn't mean that couldn't happen, but if it's a mistake, then it's going to be pretty obvious that it's a mistake, especially if they somehow manage to grow 2 or 3 inches in the span of maybe a couple of days in your story, which some stories are like that. Some stories take place in a 24-hour period. Some stories take place over generations. And so it just depends on your story. So it is possible, but it's important for me, at least, to make sure that those physical descriptions are consistent. So I write them down, even if I don't necessarily tell you in the story that they have brown eyes or they have blue eyes or they have green eyes. I want to know so that if I do have a need to introduce that physical characteristic at some point in the story, then I'm going to be consistent and I'm not going to forget that I had it one way earlier in the story and then somehow changed it because I never did write it down. And so these things are important. And another reason it's important, because it's actually interesting, because the story that I'm writing at this very moment, a story that I was hoping to have done before I started the story that I'm going to write for NaNoWriMo. But the story that I've been working on right now, it's at right about 70,000 words. So I'm really bringing it toward the finish line here. And I don't think I'm going to have it finished before NaNoWriMo, because NaNoWriMo, I guess, technically begins in about 4 hours. So from the time that I'm filming this video, which is Halloween night, October the 31st, 2020. So in that story that I'm finishing right now, as I was going through the story, the father of one of the characters, for some reason, I kept forgetting his name because I kept referring to him as Dad. And so throughout the story, I kept referring to him as Dad. And then I went back because I'm like, I know that I named him, but I couldn't remember what I named him because I kept calling him Dad. And so Dad as the name description was in my head, like heavy in my head, and I couldn't get it out of my head. So I kept calling him Dad. I kept calling him Dad. I kept calling him Dad. So I went back to the story. And I'm like, what in the world did I name him? Because I know I named him. And so I went back and I kept searching and searching and searching and searching. But because I didn't know what the name was, I couldn't remember what the name was. It was hard for me to associate. So I was searching by the last name because I had the last name. So I'm like, okay, well, maybe I established the full name, at some point in the story to introduce the character. I did not. But I did find eventually, after searching and searching and searching and searching and almost driving myself crazy in the process, I did eventually find what the character's name was. And so I went down, and usually at the bottom of my story, I'll have the synopsis information, the character sketches, because I work out of Microsoft Word. Of course, you can see that right there. I work out of Microsoft Word, although I do sometimes work out of Google Docs. And so I've used Google Docs. Actually, when my computer was down, I ended up using Google Docs for a while. I do have Scrivener as well. Trying to get more comfortable with Scrivener. I have it on a PC, and I'm told, I don't know if this is true or not, but I'm told that Scrivener is much better on a Mac than it is on PC. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that's something I've heard. Could be the stuff of legends, or it could be something that's totally legit. So anyway, I forgot the character's name, and I had to go back and find it. And eventually I was able to go and track down the name of the character to put that back into the story and to begin to reestablish his name. So he wasn't just dad, but he was dad when he's talking to the daughter. So I wanted to be able to establish when I needed to break him away from the daughter that his name was what it was. So anyway, I say all that to say to make sure that you're consistent again with names and heights and eye colors and weights and body descriptions and levels of education or whatever it is, that you're consistent from start to finish, and that you don't forget something because you forgot to outline it and you were flying by the seat of your pants, which is what I typically did for many years when I was writing novels, is that I just was a total pantser and with just the most basic idea of how the story was going to work. And then I would just kind of like, rappers do, I would just freestyle the story, and sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. Okay, so that's where I basically start right there. So the next level stuff, which I go to, as I have right here in parentheses, if I decide I'm serious about writing this particular story, is I begin with the world building and advanced world building. So that is the name of the town. If the town is fictional, then I want to make sure I have all my ducks in a row. So I want to make sure I have, the city. I want to make sure I have the county, the state, obviously. Those are things that I want to make sure that I have, so I'm consistent again from start to finish. If I add a neighboring city, then I'll put that in there as well, just to make sure again that we're consistent. If the neighboring city is in a neighboring county, then I want to make sure that that also is consistent. So I will add that later. So if the story takes place primarily at, let's say, a boarding school, then I want to have the name of the boarding school, when it was established, how many students are typically there, what is the city location and county location of the school. Again, just to make sure that everything is consistent and you don't start forgetting what year the school was established. And then you have, 1898 in one, and then you have 1899 in the other, or 1901 in another reference. So again, just making sure that I'm consistent. So world building is important for the same reason that character sketches are important. So I try to stay as consistent as possible with both of those. So from advanced world building, then I would go to my 3-act summary outline. Now there's different ways that you can do it. But I typically use the 3-act summary or 3-act outline to basically sketch out my story. Now, sometimes within the 3 acts, I'll do chapter by chapter outline if I want to really stay on track. And so I have done that sometimes. Now, one of the downsides for me of doing chapter by chapter is that if you are overly detailed, if I'm overly detailed in my chapter by chapter, sometimes I'll get bored with the story because it almost feels like I actually wrote the story. And then I sometimes lose that energy to really push forward because I feel like I've kind of done the whole story. And so I had that happen with a story that I outlined really in depth. And then a couple years ago, I outlined the story in real depth, and I liked the story a lot, but I outlined it so much that I felt like it took some of the steam out of writing the story for me because I felt like I almost already written it. So, but the good news about that is that I did pick that story back up because I had it on Google Docs, a little bit more accessible. And while I was waiting to get going with NaNoWriMo, I decided to pick that story up a little bit and just kind of test run it again to see if I was still interested in the story. And I was, and it was fun to kind of jump back into that story. So I'm typically working on a bunch of stories at any one time. So that's just the way I do it. Now, whether I'll do that in NaNoWriMo, I don't know. But like I said earlier, the one novel that I'm working on right now going into NaNoWriMo, I'm like 91% done with it. So I'm so close to the end that I'll probably be working to get the 50,000 words done for the story that I'm working on for NaNoWriMo, while also trying to wrap up this other story that I want to get done. So, all right, back to the next level stuff. So the 3-act summary, I talked about that chapter by chapter outline. Sometimes that's kind of optional, but usually if I have the 3-act outline done, then I don't necessarily need to do chapter by chapter because I'll just let it flow a little bit more because the 3-act outline typically is pretty thorough right there without getting quite so granular with a chapter by chapter. So then from there, I'll sometimes do advanced character outlines. So I'll go a little bit more in depth, like, for example, their education, with their personality characteristics that I want to keep consistent to, so you know how your character would react if they're put in a certain situation. So that's what you want your reader to be able to understand. Like by the time they get to the end of the book, you know how Jan is going to react if she's in this situation because you've come to understand her character and what she's like, what her emotions are like, what motivates her. You know, what are things that she hates? What are things that she loves? What are situations that she likes being in and that she can handle, or situations that she hates being in because she doesn't handle quite so well? I want to make sure that you know that, so that by the end of the story, you know how Jan is going to react to that situation that she finds herself in, because I have done a good job. If I've done my job the right way, I've done a good job of making sure that you understand her inside and out without being all exposition-y. You've been able to figure out and determine what she's going to be like because I've done my job, hopefully, of making sure that you really understand how the character works. So, things to consider. I mentioned earlier that sometimes um, doing too much with the outline can really hurt you. So I think you want to leave some things for the imagination. Now, if you write it, the outline, and you are extremely detailed in how you write that outline, it doesn't mean you can't pump the brakes while you're writing the story and say, okay, you know what? I want to go in a different direction. But I think sometimes you can feel married to the outline once you start it, and you're like, okay, I started on this road. I want to be true to the outline. I want to really work through, because a lot of times people will tell you when you start writing, don't worry about going back and editing and fixing things. Just kind of keep flowing. And that does typically work for me. Once I start going, I want to flow through as much as possible. But I have to kick myself every once in a while because I do want to go back and I want to edit this because I'm like, I kind of like where I was going with that, but I don't quite like the way I did it. So I'm going to go back and fix it. So I try to stop myself more and more from doing that because I want to just flow and get the story down. And then you go back and you start doing some of the real heavy lifting. And that's with the editing that you're going to do at some point once you finish that first draft. So, so to each their own. If you are going through it and you are thinking, I want to stay on track, I'm very detail oriented. And if I don't have this very detailed outline, then I'm going to get derailed at some point and I'm going to lose interest in the project. And then it's going to go to the story graveyard. Now, I have a lot of stories in my story graveyard. Believe me, I've got stacks and stacks and stacks of composition books from when I first started writing in high school to you know, file after file after file of stories that I started on my computer, but never finished for one reason or another. Typically, it's because I lost interest at some point, or something else popped up that was just more interesting to me, and so I moved from that story that I stalled on to something that's new, fresh, and exciting. So that happens. So be careful with your outline. You know, make sure that you have a good parameter in place, a good parameters in place. A good foundation in place. So you have your start, your middle, your end, your first act, your second act, and your third act. And typically, if you at least do that, you have your character sketches, and you know you have your world building set. If you do those things, you're typically going to be in pretty good shape. So second thing to consider before I get ready to close it out is that when I got stuck, it was at that 15 to 25,000 word mark. And typically you've set the scene, you have your conflict, you've established your characters, and now it's like, where do you go from there? So that's when you get into that second act. And if you're not able to transition from act 1 to act 2, you're going to fall flat on your face. And that's typically what I've done 9 out of 10 times with the stories that I have not finished, that I've put significant effort into writing. And when I say significant effort, that typically for me is 10 to 15,000 words. I know I put 15 to 25,000 here, but usually, like I said, 15 to 20,000 is typically where I would stall. But if I get 25, past 25 up to 30, then I'll typically finish it, because it just, that means I've hit a groove and I feel really good about where it's going. And I know that I have enough momentum going to keep this thing going right through to the finish. So that means I'm enthusiastic about the characters. I'm enthusiastic about the story and how it's progressing. And I have a vision for how it's going to end, even if I did not put it initially in the outline. If I didn't put it in the 3-act outline or the full-blown outline, I have a pretty good idea in my head how it's going to end, and then how I'm going to get to the end. So that's something that it really is helpful for me, so that I do not stall at 10, 15, 20, 25,000 words. If I get to 25,000, I'm getting pretty close to that 30,000 word mark. And usually I'll finish it there, especially if it's a shorter novel. And so for me, short novels are in the 50 to 70,000 range. That's short for me. That might be a little bit longer than what some people would think of as being short. But for me, a full length novel, a short one would be 50 to 70,000 words. And so if you get to 30, then, you're more than halfway to the minimum. So that's typically a good sign that I'm going to end up finishing it. So anyway, that's it. That's just some real basic outline stuff that I had in my mind that I wanted to share with you guys. This is my first time really using Streamyard right now, at least me using Streamyard. I've joined other people on Streamyard. So I wanted to test it out. At the same time, I also wanted to share this little nugget as I get ready for NaNoWriMo. So so that's kind of where it's at, and just really excited about jumping into NaNoWriMo. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I know some people that are going to be involved in it, and that's a great thing. And hopefully I'll make find some writing buddies that I can help inspire, and they can help inspire me, and we can all push through this and reach those 50,000 word goals that we're going to have for ourselves. And so I'm excited because for me, it's a new project that I'm starting, and it's a project that I've invested probably, if not the most time in pre-gaming, it's pretty close to the most. I've put a lot of effort into pre-gaming for this particular book. The outline is pretty much on point. There are a couple little things that I'm going to tweak here on the eve of NaNoWriMo, October the 31st, Halloween night. There's a couple small things that I want to tweak, but the main thing I want to make sure that I have ready to go when I start writing, which I probably will start at midnight. I'm going to, it's tempting to start it beforehand, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stay true to the game. So once the clock strikes midnight, I'm probably going to get going with NaNoWriMo. So I want to really get going with that. Usually the first page is important. If I can start and get some momentum early, then that's usually a good sign for me that I'm gonna be doing well. And once I get on a roll, I'm gonna be in pretty good shape, because again, I've done 50,000 words. I've done more than that. I think the most I've ever done in a month is probably pushing pretty close to 80,000. That was a story that I was particularly excited about doing. It's a long story, and I actually have a video coming up on this channel where I talk about that, where I was pissed off about something, and I just channeled that into some good writing energy, and that was the way that I could vent and to get it out of my system, and to be able to move on to turn a negative into a positive. And so that's what I was able to do with that particular situation. So it is possible. This is, of course, a situation where I'm not angry about anything in particular. So, I don't have that little additional motivation there to push me. But at the same time, the story I'm doing is pretty exciting. It's a sibling story. There's a sports element. There's a large crime element to it, and it's going to be interesting. There's a racial component to it as well. So I'm really excited about this story. I think it's going to be a lot of fun to work on it. And it was a story that was one of those stories that hit me, I think, at like 3 a.m, and I started to write it down, because usually when I get a good story idea, I just want to write it down, get it on computer or on paper, more so on computer. Sometimes I'll, dictate it to my phone and then pick it up later, because if you get sometimes you get a good story idea, and if you don't write it down, you forget it. And you just, once it's gone, it may never come back. And there's some stories that I have not written down, and yet it keeps coming back in my head. It keeps popping back in my head over and over and over again. And this story that I'm going to work on for NaNoWriMo is one of those stories that just kept popping back in my head. And so I kept thinking that even if I hadn't actually written it down when I did, that it was probably one of those stories that I would have kept having pop in my head. And usually when that happens, that's a good sign that your boy needs to really jump on that one and make sure that, he takes care of business. So that was the case with this one. So looking forward to it. I'm going to check in with NaNoWriMo here in a little bit as we close out Halloween evening here. Some of the kids were out here in the neighborhood. I didn't give away candy. I don't normally give away candy anyway. But it was, with everything going on, it just didn't seem like a good idea, even though I was in probably a little better mood about it, or would have been in a little better mood about it this year than I would maybe in other years. But anyway, that's a digression here. So looking for something positive to come out of NaNoWriMo. November is going to be a crazy November. I think we already know that. The presidential election's coming up next week. And if you think it's been crazy to this point, my goodness, what is election night going to be like? I went in my garage, and another sidebar here. I went in my garage, and I had all these old newspapers, and what should I happen to find but newspapers from 2000, the Bush-Gore election ongoing saga that kind of had our attention for, I don't know, what was it, at least a couple months that went on, and counting ballots and hanging chads and all that stuff that you got to think that we're going to see a lot of that here in 2020. Here 20 years later, we may be reliving history here, and we could see a presidential election that could end up in the courts. But who knows? We'll see what happens when the people speak, and hopefully, all the people that want to vote will have that opportunity. They'll get out and vote and make their voices heard, and hopefully, even at least as much as that all the votes will be counted and be counted fairly, and we'll have a just and fair decision. The electors will do what they're supposed to do, and follow the will of the people, and we'll have the president that we're supposed to have for good or better, or worse, I should say, depending on your perspective. So anyway, that's all with that. So hopefully NaNoWriMo, regardless of your political affiliation, there'll be some fun that'll come out of NaNoWriMo, and it'll be hopefully a positive to come out of what's been a crazy year, 2020. I don't think too many people are excited about reliving a lot of the stuff that's happened in 2020. So we're coming toward the end of 2020 and hoping for some good times here. Hopefully something positive will come out of the presidential election. Hopefully people, you'll be able to spend some safe and quality time with your loved ones over Thanksgiving and over Christmas, and whatever other holidays you may celebrate, particularly during the month of December. So hopefully you guys will be able to do that and do that safely, and we'll all be able to work through this. But I'm excited. I think NaNoWriMo is just going to be a really cool thing. It's funny, for years I've heard about it, but I've never actually participated in it. And frankly, it was probably lazy on my part. I just never really looked into it very much. I just kept hearing people say NaNoWriMo, and I never really took the time to associate it to National Novel Writing Month. So how sad is that in 2020? So I guess that's one of the good things that came out of 2020 is I learned what NaNoWriMo is, National Novel Writing Month. So I'm excited about that. Signed up on NaNoWriMo.org. And so looking forward to that, and hopefully I'll buddy read with some people, and we'll work together toward our individual goals, and we'll work together as if it's a shared goal. So that's all I got. So with that, I'm going to bring this broadcast to an end. Thank you for watching this video whenever you watch it. And I'll be back here with more videos. I'm going to be doing a lot of probably live writing sprints here during NaNoWriMo. So be on the lookout for that as well coming up. So peace out, family. See you soon.